The ringing of my cell phone pierced through the quiet stillness of my apartment. I glanced at the caller ID and felt a twinge of apprehension seeing my mother's name flash across the screen. Our relationship had been strained lately, a tangled web of unresolved tensions and past grievances. With a resigned sigh, I answered the call. "Lila, thank goodness you picked up." My mother's tremulous voice crackled through the line, laced with an urgency that instantly put me on edge. "Mom, what's wrong? You sound upset," I said, my brow furrowing with concern. It's terrible," she stammered, her words tumbling out in a jumbled rush. "I've been scammed, Lila. Someone claiming to be Franklin called and convinced me to transfer my life savings to an account they provided." A sickening dread washed over me as the weight of her words sank in. Franklin was my cousin, a kind-hearted man who would never stoop to such deceit. My mind raced, trying to make sense of this unfathomable situation. "Are you sure it wasn't Franklin? Why would he do something like that?" I asked, my voice tinged with disbelief. "I don't know, but I'm certain it wasn't him," she insisted, her voice quivering with anguish. "I've lost everything, Lila. My retirement fund, the money I'd saved for emergencies, all gone." A surge of anger mingled with my shock, and I clenched my fist involuntarily. How could someone exploit the trust of an elderly woman like my mother? The thought made my blood boil, and I knew I had to get to the bottom of this despicable act. "Mom, listen to me," I said, my voice firm and resolute. "We're going to figure this out. I promise you, I won't rest until we uncover the truth and hold the person responsible accountable." A heavy silence hung between us, punctuated only by the sound of my mother's shuddering breaths. Finally, she spoke, her voice weighted with a mix of gratitude and resignation. "Thank you, Lila. I knew I could count on you." As I ended the call, a steely determination settled within me. This deceit had crossed a line, and I vowed to leave no stone unturned in my quest for justice. Little did I know that this was merely the beginning of a journey that would test the boundaries of trust and loyalty, one that would force me to confront the harsh realities of deception, even from those closest to me. Gripping the steering wheel tightly, I navigated the winding country roads that led to my mother's house, a sense of trepidation weighing heavily on my mind. The conversation with Edith had left me reeling, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this sordid tale than met the eye. As the miles melted away, my thoughts drifted to Nate, my husband of 12 years. Our marriage had been a tumultuous one, marred by his reckless financial decisions and a gambling addiction that had nearly bankrupted us years ago. I had worked tirelessly to rebuild our lives, but the scars of that betrayal still lingered, festering like an open wound. "You're overreacting, Lila," Nate had scoffed dismissively when I told him about the scam. "Your mother's just getting forgetful in her old age. It's probably a misunderstanding." His cavalier attitude only fueled my suspicions, and I found myself questioning his potential involvement. Could he have orchestrated this elaborate scheme to swindle my mother's savings? The thought made my stomach churn, but I couldn't ignore the lingering doubts that gnawed at me. As I pulled into the familiar driveway, memories of my childhood came flooding back. Laughter-filled summers spent chasing fireflies, the comforting scent of my mother's homemade apple pie wafting through the house. But those idyllic recollections were tainted by the harsh reality of the present, a reality where trust had been shattered, and deception cast a dark shadow over our once close family. Edith greeted me at the door, her face etched with worry lines that seemed to have deepened since our last encounter. Without a word, she ushered me inside, and we settled into the living room, a graveyard of faded photographs and mementos from happier times. "I've been going over the bank statements," she began, her voice wavering slightly. "There are multiple transfers to an account I've never seen before, all made under the guise of family emergencies." I studied the documents she handed me, my heart sinking as I traced the paper trail of deceit. A sick feeling settled in the pit of my stomach as I noticed a pattern. The account numbers bore an eerie resemblance to those I had once shared with Nate during our financial entanglement. "Mom," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "I think I might know who's behind this." Edith's eyes widened, a flicker of hope mingled with fear dancing across her features. I knew then that I had to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. My mother had been betrayed in the cruelest way imaginable, and I would stop at nothing to ensure justice was served. The musty scent of old photograph albums and faded memories hung heavy in the air as Edith and I pored over the financial records strewn across the coffee table. With each passing moment, the tangled web of deceit grew more intricate, more suffocating. "I can't believe Nate would do something like this," Edith murmured, her voice laced with a mixture of disbelief and hurt. "After everything you two have been through together." I pursed my lips, trying to maintain an air of composure, but the anger simmering beneath the surface threatened to boil over. Nate's gambling addiction had nearly torn our family apart years ago, and the scars of that betrayal still ran deep. "Money was always his weakness," I said bitterly, sifting through the stack of bank statements. "But to steal from his own mother-in-law? That's a new low, even for him." Edith's eyes glistened with unshed tears as she studied the documents, her hands trembling slightly. "Look at this," she whispered, sliding a printout toward me. My gaze fell upon a series of transactions, each one more substantial than the last, all funneled into an account bearing an uncanny resemblance to the ones Nate and I had shared during our financial struggles. "Do you think?" Edith's voice trailed off, but the implication hung heavy in the air. I clenched my jaw, a surge of fury coursing through my veins. The evidence was damning, but a part of me still clung to the faint hope that there was a reasonable explanation, that Nate hadn't truly sunk to such despicable depths. "I need to talk to him," I said, my tone resolute. "If he's involved in this, he's going to come clean, and he's going to make things right." Edith nodded, her expression a mixture of sadness and determination. As I stood to leave, she reached out and grasped my hand, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman of her age. "Be careful, Lila," she cautioned. "If Nate is capable of betraying his own family like this, there's no telling how far he'll go to cover his tracks." Her words sent a chill down my spine, but I pushed the nagging sense of dread aside. I had to confront Nate, to look him in the eye and demand the truth, no matter how ugly it might be. As I made my way to the car, the weight of the situation pressed down on me like a suffocating blanket. But beneath the surface, a steely resolve burned bright. I would get to the bottom of this, and if Nate was indeed the mastermind behind this heinous scheme, he would face the full consequences of his actions. Family or not, there would be no mercy for those who preyed on the vulnerable and exploited the sacred bonds of trust. The quaint local cafe was a familiar haunt, but the welcoming ambiance did little to quell the storm of emotions brewing within me as I waited for Nate to arrive. My heart pounded with a mixture of dread and anticipation, and I found myself fidgeting nervously with the sugar packets on the table. When he finally walked through the door, a forced smile etched onto his features, I felt a surge of anger rise within me. How dare he play the role of the oblivious husband when the evidence of his betrayal was staring us in the face? "Leela, sweetheart," he greeted, leaning in to plant a kiss on my cheek. I recoiled instinctively, and his brow furrowed in confusion. "What's going on? You said we needed to discuss our finances." I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the confrontation to come. "Cut the act, Nate," I said, my voice low and steady. "I know about the scam. I know you've been siphoning money from my mother's accounts." His eyes widened briefly, but he quickly regained his composure, a practiced mask of innocence sliding into place. "Whoa, slow down. What are you talking about? I would never do anything to hurt your mom." I slid the stack of bank statements across the table, the damning evidence laid bare before him. "These transactions tell a different story. The account numbers match ones we used years ago when you nearly gambled us into bankruptcy." Nate's gaze flickered to the papers, and for a moment I saw a flicker of fear cross his features. But just as quickly it was gone, replaced by a cavalier shrug. "Coincidence," he scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "You're reading too much into this, Lila." I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to reach across the table and shake him until the truth came spilling out. "Don't lie to me, Nate. Not again. I want the truth, all of it." His eyes narrowed, and a hint of the darkness that lurked beneath his charming facade began to seep through. "You're never going to let that go, are you?" he sneered. "Always holding the past over my head, never giving me a chance to move on." I recoiled at the venom in his words, but I refused to back down. If you're innocent, then explain these transactions. Explain why my mother was duped into transferring her life savings to an account linked to you." Nate's jaw clenched, and for a moment I thought he might actually come clean. But then, as if a switch had been flipped, his expression softened, and he reached across the table, placing his hand over mine. "Lila, listen to me," he said, his voice dripping with feigned sincerity. "I know things haven't been easy between us, but I promise you, I had nothing to do with this. Your mother must have gotten confused or fallen for some scam artist's lies." I wanted so desperately to believe him, to cling to the shreds of trust that still remained between us, but the evidence was damning, and the seed of doubt had taken root, growing with every evasive answer and half-truth that spilled from his lips. As I left the cafe, my mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Part of me still clung to the hope that Nate was innocent, that this was all a colossal misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew the truth. He was involved, and I would stop at nothing to expose his deceit and make him pay for betraying our family's trust. The private investigator's office was dimly lit, the air thick with the lingering scent of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. As I sank into the worn leather chair across from him, I couldn't help but feel a sense of trepidation. This was the last resort, the final gambit in my desperate quest to uncover the truth about Nate's involvement in the scam against my mother. "What can I do for you, Miss Thompson?" the PI asked, his voice a gruff rumble that seemed to match the no-nonsense demeanor he exuded. I took a deep breath, steeling my nerves. "I need you to investigate my husband, Nate Thompson. I believe he's been involved in a scheme to defraud my elderly mother out of her life savings." The PI raised an eyebrow, his expression betraying no hint of surprise or judgment. "That's a serious accusation. What makes you suspect your husband?" Without hesitation, I laid out the evidence, the suspicious bank transfers, the evasive answers, and Nate's history with financial misdeeds. As I spoke, the PI's gaze never wavered, his eyes sharp and analytical. "I'll need to gather more information, but based on what you've told me, it's certainly possible your husband is involved," he said finally, his tone pragmatic. "Do you have any leads or potential accomplices we should look into?" I hesitated, my mind flashing back to Nate's odd behavior during our confrontation at the cafe. There had been something almost rehearsed about his denials, as if he were reading from a script. There might be someone else involved, I mused aloud. During our conversation, Nate seemed coached almost, like he was sticking to a predetermined story. The PI nodded, jotting down a few notes. "All right, we'll start digging into his associates, see if anyone stands out. But you should prepare yourself, Miss Thompson. If your husband is guilty, the truth might not be pretty." His words hung heavy in the air, a sobering reminder of the potential consequences that lay ahead. But I had come too far to turn back now. Nate's betrayal had cut deeper than any wound, and I was determined to see justice served, no matter the cost. Over the next few days, the PI's investigation yielded startling results. Nate had been funneling my mother's money into a separate account, one belonging to a mysterious woman named Clarissa Green. Surveillance footage and financial records painted a damning picture. Nate and Clarissa had been meeting regularly, their interactions laced with an intimacy that suggested a deeper connection than mere acquaintances. As the pieces fell into place, a sickening realization dawned on me. Nate hadn't just orchestrated this scam for financial gain. He had done it to fund his sordid affair with this Clarissa woman, using my mother's hard-earned savings as a twisted means to an end. The depth of his depravity was staggering, and I found myself consumed by a burning rage unlike anything I had ever experienced before. Nate had not only betrayed our family's trust, but he had also desecrated the sanctity of our marriage vows, all for the sake of his selfish desires. As I clutched the damning evidence in my trembling hands, a steely resolve took hold. Nate and his accomplice would face the full weight of their crimes, and I would be the one to deliver them to justice, no matter how painful the journey might be. This was more than just a quest for restitution. It was a battle for redemption, a chance to reclaim the trust and honor that had been so callously stripped away. The crisp autumn air did little to temper the fury simmering within me as I strode purposefully through the park, clutching the damning evidence against my chest. Nate's betrayal had left a bitter taste in my mouth, a festering wound that refused to heal. As he came into view, seated on a weathered park bench, my steps faltered momentarily. Despite everything, a part of me still clung to the foolish hope that this was all some colossal misunderstanding, that the man I had vowed to love and cherish wasn't capable of such depravity. But as our eyes met, any lingering doubt evaporated. His expression was a carefully constructed mask of indifference, but I could see the flicker of fear in his eyes as he registered the steely resolve etched onto my features. "Lila?" he greeted, rising to his feet with a nervous chuckle. "What's all this about? You're looking at me like you're about to start swinging." I bristled at his nonchalant demeanor, my fingers tightening around the stack of documents. "Cut the act, Nate. I know everything." His bravado faltered, and he shifted uncomfortably, jamming his hands into his pockets. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't play dumb with me," I snapped, my voice trembling with barely contained rage. "I have proof that you've been siphoning money from my mother's accounts, funneling it into a separate fund to support your affair with that woman, Clarissa." Nate's eyes widened, and for a moment the mask slipped, revealing a glimpse of the true monster lurking beneath the surface. But just as quickly he regained his composure, shaking his head in feigned disbelief. "That's a pretty wild accusation, Lila. Do you really think I'm capable of something like that?" "I used to think you were a better man than this," I countered, my words laced with bitterness. "But the evidence speaks for itself. You've been lying to me, to my mother, to everyone who trusted you." Nate's jaw clenched, and a flicker of anger danced across his features. "So what? You're just going to throw away our entire marriage over some circumstantial evidence, after everything we've been through together?" His words were like a slap to the face, and I recoiled as if struck. "Our marriage was built on lies and deceit, Nate. This is just the final nail in the coffin." For a moment, silence stretched between us, the weight of our shattered vows hanging heavy in the air. Then, with a weary sigh, Nate sank back onto the bench, his head cradled in his hands. "You're right," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I did it. All of it. The money, the affair, everything." As his confession washed over me, I felt a strange sense of relief mingled with an overwhelming sadness. The truth had finally come to light, but at what cost? "Why, Nate?" I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. "Why would you betray your own family like this?" He lifted his head, and the expression on his face was one of pure remorse, or perhaps it was simply a masterful performance, another layer of deceit. "I was weak," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the ground. "The gambling, the debts, I thought I could handle it. But then Clarissa came along, and suddenly there was this tantalizing escape from reality. I never meant to hurt you or your mother, but I got in too deep. I'm sorry, Lila." His apology rang hollow, a feeble attempt to salvage what little shred of humanity remained within him. As I studied his broken form, I felt a strange sense of pity. Not for him, but for the man I had once believed him to be. "Save your excuses," I spat, turning on my heel. "You'll have plenty of time to reflect on your mistakes when you're behind bars." As I walked away, leaving Nate to wallow in the ruins of his own making, a sense of grim determination settled over me. The road ahead would be long and arduous, but I was prepared to see this through to the bitter end. Justice would be served, and my family's honor would be restored. No matter the cost. The police station was a hive of controlled chaos, a flurry of activity that betrayed little of the gravity of the situation at hand. As I sat across from Detective Garcia, a seasoned veteran with a no-nonsense demeanor, I couldn't help but feel a sense of trepidation. "Miss Thompson, are you certain you want to go through with this?" he asked, his gaze piercing. "Once we set this sting operation in motion, there's no turning back." I took a deep breath, steeling my resolve. Nate's confession had been a bitter pill to swallow, but it had also galvanized my determination to see justice served. No longer was this a personal vendetta. It was a matter of principle, of upholding the sanctity of the law. "I'm sure, Detective," I replied, my voice unwavering. "Nate and his accomplice, Clarissa, need to face the consequences of their actions. They've hurt my family deeply, and I won't rest until they're behind bars." Garcia nodded, a flicker of respect crossing his weathered features. "All right, then, here's the plan." The details were intricate. A a carefully orchestrated dance of deception and misdirection. Nate would be lured to a predetermined location under the guise of a supposed transfer of more of my mother's funds to Clarissa. Little would he know that the entire scenario was a meticulously crafted trap, with undercover officers lying in wait to apprehend them both in the act. As the hour of reckoning drew near, I found myself pacing the confines of the surveillance van, my heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Despite Nate's despicable actions, a part of me still clung to the lingering threads of affection that had once bound us together, threads that now felt frayed and tattered beyond repair. The radio crackled to life, signaling the commencement of the operation. Through the grainy footage on the monitors, I watched as Nate arrived at the rendezvous point, his shoulders hunched and his gaze darting nervously from side to side. Moments later, Clarissa appeared, a predatory smile playing across her lips as she approached Nate. The exchange was brief, a flurry of hushed words and furtive glances, before the unmistakable exchange of an envelope, the supposed payment for their vile deeds. That was the signal the officers had been waiting for. In a blur of movement, they descended upon the unsuspecting duo, their shouts of "Police! Don't move!" ringing out like a death knell. Nate's expression was one of pure, unadulterated horror as the handcuffs clicked into place around his wrists. Clarissa, on the other hand, remained defiant, spitting venom and curses at the officers who restrained her. As they were led away, their heads bowed in ignominy, I felt a strange sense of hollowness settle within me. The adrenaline that had propelled me this far had dissipated, leaving me adrift in a sea of conflicting emotions. Justice had been served, but at what cost? The man I had once loved was now a mere shell of his former self, a cautionary tale of greed and deceit run amok. And yet, beneath the sorrow and the anger, there was a glimmer of hope. A hope that my family could begin to rebuild and heal from the wounds inflicted by this betrayal. As I stepped out of the van, the cool evening air caressing my face, I allowed myself a small, bittersweet smile. The road ahead would be long and arduous, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could see the light at the end of the tunnel. A future where trust and honor were not mere concepts, but the bedrock upon which our lives would be rebuilt. The courtroom was a study in contrasts. The polished wood paneling and imposing marble columns exuded a sense of grandeur, while the stern expressions etched onto the faces of the judge and jury spoke volumes about the gravity of the proceedings. As Nate and Clarissa were led in, their wrists bound by heavy shackles, I couldn't help but feel a surge of vindication. The smug arrogance that had once defined their demeanor had been replaced by a palpable air of defeat, a silent acknowledgement that their web of lies had finally unraveled. The trial was a formality, a mere exercise in due process. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Bank records, surveillance footage, and my own damning testimony painted a picture of calculated deception and breach of trust. As the judge handed down their sentences, 15 years for Nate, 10 for Clarissa, I searched their faces for any semblance of remorse. But all I saw was a hollow emptiness, a chasm where their souls should have been. It was over. The nightmare that had consumed my life for what felt like an eternity had finally reached its conclusion. And yet, as I watched the bailiffs lead them away, I felt no sense of victory, no cathartic release from the torment they had inflicted upon my family. The restitution we received, a paltry sum in comparison to the emotional toll of their betrayal, did little to assuage the lingering ache in my heart. My mother's savings had been replenished, but her trust in humanity had been shattered, a wound that would take far longer to heal. As we stepped out into the crisp autumn air, Edith turned to me, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "It's over, Lila," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We can finally move on." I nodded, forcing a smile that felt hollow and brittle. "Yes, Mom, we can start rebuilding our lives." And yet, as we embraced, I couldn't shake the feeling that a part of me had been irrevocably changed by this ordeal. The blind trust I had once placed in those closest to me had been shattered, replaced by a gnawing sense of doubt that threatened to consume me. In the weeks that followed, Edith and I made a conscious effort to forge ahead, to reclaim the lives that had been so cruelly disrupted by Nate and Clarissa's actions. We downsized, selling the family home and seeking solace in a cozy apartment in the heart of the city. As we unpacked the remnants of our past, sifting through boxes of cherished mementos and faded photographs, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. So much had been lost, not just material possessions, but the very foundations upon which our family had been built. But amidst the rubble, there was a glimmer of hope, a newfound appreciation for the unbreakable bond that had kept us together through this tumultuous journey. We had been tested, our faith in humanity shaken to its core, but we had emerged on the other side, battered but not broken. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of crimson and gold, I found myself standing at the window, gazing out at the bustling cityscape below. A new chapter was unfolding, one filled with equal parts trepidation and possibility. The road to healing would be long and arduous, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I could see a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. A future where trust and redemption were not mere concepts, but tangible rewards for those brave enough to weather the storm.